Bismillah wa Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. We continue in our marriage preparation course, and we now are in the sixth session. We wanted to review once again the reasons why people get married. And last time we met, we were talking about the question, are you marrying for the right reason? And we were overviewing or going over Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we were mentioning that Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a psychological tool by which to understand the human being. And we applied that psychological tool to the concept of marriage. And we said that there's these 5 needs that Maslow organizes as being some of the most important needs that a human being has. Firstly, physiological needs. And physiological needs are those needs which have to do with supporting the basic conditions of life. The human being has a need for air, for water, for food, for shelter, for sleep, for clothing, and in order for life to continue to reproduce. And we mentioned that in the context of marriage in part addresses some basic physiological needs, such as the need for food and water and shelter and having a place to sleep, clothing, and a means by which to engage in reproduction, and thus the expression of sex. And that basically is talking about biological reproduction. Maslow also talked about the human being having the need to feel safe. Safety needs are some of the core needs of the human being. Personal safety and a sense of feeling at ease and tranquil, free from abuse. Also, part of safety needs are the ability to secure life for yourself, which means that human beings have to have access to the economy, to health, and to housing. And so the safety needs and the physiological needs overlap. And so we talked about how in Islamic thinking, men and women are protectors of one another. And we talked about how in order to maintain the family, economics is important as well as health. And yes, housing as well. Loving belonging is another set of needs that Maslow highlights. The need for friendship, intimacy, the need for family, and a sense of connection. So marriage also provides this. In a sense of esteem, he mentions. Sense of respect, self-esteem, status, recognition, strength, freedom. And so we find that marriage allows us to be able to give and receive respect. Is a relationship in which we develop, if it's healthy, a sense of self-esteem on top of what we should already have. It's a relationship in which there's roles and recognition of those roles, being a husband, being a father, being a wife, being a mother, being a sibling, being an older sibling, so on and so forth. It's a place in which we should be able to exercise our freedom. We should be able to decision make together. We should be able to consult. It's a place in which we can grow in our strength, in our ability to think and decision make, in our ability to take courses of action, and our ability to grow. The family structure should be that protective structure which gives the human being a place, right? A place. And lastly, Maslow talks about the idea of self-actualization, the desire to be the best as the peak need. If we look at the Maslow's hierarchy as like kind of like a pyramid, so all the way at the top of the pyramid is this issue of self-actualization to become the best. We mentioned that comes close to the idea of ihsan in Islam. But we find that most of these needs, although Maslow addresses them to the individual, we find that marriage itself fulfills many of these needs. And we come down to the question of why is it that people marry? Maslow's hierarchy of needs teaches us that as human beings, we're created with certain needs. And the institution of marriage fulfills those needs. But then there's another reality that we encounter is that people have their own reasons why it is that they seek out marriage. Although we see that marriage can fulfill the needs that we mentioned in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, people have their own reasons many times as to why they seek to marry. Sometimes people are seeking to preserve their chastity, to protect themselves from falling into sexual activity which is considered to be forbidden in Islam. And so marriage becomes that way in which a person can have, or that means by which a person can exercise sexual activity and it be considered acceptable in Islamic teaching. We have a hadith wherein the Prophet ﷺ said, "O young people, whoever among you can marry should marry because it helps lower the gaze, guard modesty, and whoever is not able to marry should fast, as fasting diminishes sexual appetite." This hadith frames the section in this chapter in which it said that some people marry because they're seeking to preserve their chastity. And so the advice of the Prophet ﷺ to seek out marriage as a way to guard oneself when it comes to sexual activity is being presented here. I wanted to pause for a moment and I wanted to say that yes, some people marry for that reason, right? But they, in many cases, they want to marry for that reason, but they're not looking at the other needs that the human being has for marriage. So they make sexual activity a primary reason as to why it is that they get married. And some of the other needs that I mentioned that are noted at the psychological level, loving, belonging, self-esteem, the desire to become the best, safety needs, and so on and so forth, those things are not properly understood, or those things are not even the focus points. And so I wanted to pause to say that some people, they marry to safeguard themselves, but they have no issue, like sex is not a problem for them. And then you have other people that they want to hide in marriage. They want to get married in the name of preserving themselves. But the reason why they're seeking marriage is not 100% a healthy reason, even though it may be legit. It's legitimate to want to seek out marriage to exercise sexual activity. There's no issue in and of itself when we look at marriage from that angle. The problem comes when people are seeking marriage, but they are either in denial or very clear with themselves that they have a sex addiction. And I wanted to talk about the idea of sex addiction and how it's understood in the psychological manual of mental disorders. Right? Firstly, sex addiction is defined as a lack of control over sexual thoughts, urges, and impulses. While sexual impulses are natural, sex addiction only refers to behaviors that are done in excess and significantly impact one's life in a negative way. They disrupt life. We see that the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ emphasizes the issue of marriage, and it exercises the issue of knowing how to control oneself properly. And when we look at sex addiction, in the diagnostic manual is not listed as a diagnosable condition, which is a problem. But what is looked at is the idea of having an addiction, and then under the idea of having an addiction, sex can be something to be considered a problem. But in and of itself, sex addiction is not listed as a diagnosable condition. What research suggests is that excess sexual behavior, it can function in the same way that a chemical addiction, drug addiction, in other words, can function. A person with sex addiction may have a compulsive need to be sexually stimulated, and this interferes with their ability to function on the daily life. Sexual addictions can come in many forms: sexual acts, prostitution, watching or consuming pornography, masturbation or sexual fantasy, exhibition or voyeurism. Sex addicts may alter their activities to perform sexual acts, persistently unable to control their behavior despite any consequences. This compulsive sexual behavior can have serious personal consequences like drug or alcohol addiction. Sex addiction can impact physical health, mental health, personal relationships, and one's quality of life. Now, there's some signs that come into sex addiction. It can manifest itself in different ways, physical and emotional. It takes a healthcare professional to make a clear diagnosis, right? But we mentioned that in the psychological manual of diagnoses, it's not there, but there's some sort of schema or framework that's being used. One, obsessive sexual thoughts. Someone dealing with a sex addiction may find themselves thinking persistently about sex. These chronic thoughts of sex or sexual fantasy may become obsessive or interfere with other responsibilities. Spending excessive time on sex. While seeking out a partner isn't necessarily a sign of sexual addiction, if someone is spending excessive amounts of time and energy on sex, it might be a red flag. Right? This can include spending time to acquire sex, having sex, being sexual, recovering from sexual experiences. Feeling shame or depression. If a need for sex crosses over into an addiction, someone's sexual feelings might also be interspersed, wrapped up in, with feelings of anxiety, shame, depression, or regret. The individual may feel shame about their sexual urges and their difficulty controlling those urges because they know that they have an addiction and they know that it's out of hand. So, in that struggle of trying to control themselves and limit their sexual experiences, which most probably are illicit or wrong, then because they may be harmful in the way that they're undertaken, and Islamically they may be prohibited. And so shame comes about because they're battling that. They may even show signs of clinical depression or suicidal ideation, thinking about suicide. Masturbating excessively. While masturbation can be a healthy way to explore sexuality and express sexual drive, even though Islam has its ruling on masturbation. And the ruling on masturbation is that masturbation, for the most part, for majority of scholars, is impermissible. And for a small minority, it's permissible if one fears for their well-being. It's better than going to fornication. It's better than going to prostitution, that type of thing. So a small group of scholars look at masturbation as being permissible as a way to protect oneself. Majority of the scholars say that it's not permissible, and they see marriage as a solution. But the problem that we have is that if a person has a sex addiction, marriage in and of itself is not going to help them. That's why I paused on this to say that the Prophet ﷺ is emphasizing this issue of fasting in a case where a person can't marry to control the sexual appetite. But what we see in sex addiction is that when a person aims at marriage, and that is not necessarily the case that that sex addiction is going to be resolved, because sex now is associated with addiction, and that can be detrimental to the health of the marriage, right? Engaging in risky and inappropriate behaviors, cheating on partners, committing sex offenses. Okay, so at the end, dealing with sex addiction may require professional help, like dealing with a psychologist or psychiatrist or an actual sex therapist. Right? You may need one-on-one therapy. You may need to use cognitive behavior therapy, group therapy, support, or counseling of some sort. But at the end of the day, the reason why I brought this issue out is that people, if they're going to marry for the sake of preserving chastity, then the person should go into that relationship being honest with themselves and what they're struggling with. They shouldn't go trying to escape the fact that they're dealing with a sex addiction. Yes, marriage, part of it is sex, part of it is preserving one's chastity. But marriage is not going to address a sexual problem that's unaddressed. See what I'm saying? What's going to end up happening is that within the context of that marriage, that person that's struggling with that addiction, that person is going to have an impact on their partner in a negative way. And so people that struggle with sex addiction, they have to be honest with themselves, and they have to be willing to grow into a new orientation. And that may mean seeking professional help, or it may mean being able to reorient oneself without that professional help. That depends on the person. But the partner that you're marrying shouldn't be subjected to the negative effects that result from sex addiction. And that's why I mentioned that, yes, people may say marriage is to preserve one's chastity, and a person, for instance, that's going through the struggle of sex addiction, they can benefit from marriage, but in reality, they can benefit, but they also are bringing damage to their partner because they're not ready to be fully present in their relationship. I'm not saying don't get married, but I'm saying that you need to get help. You need to get help. Because the Prophet ﷺ, when he envisioned marriage, is not just running from sex. It's people that have life discipline, that they're ready to go into that relationship and contribute to that relationship in a healthy way. And for today, I want to stop there. So preserving chastity is one of the reasons that people get married. It's a good reason to get married. But what do we mean by preserving chastity? Are we preserving chastity from the angle of just taking care of ourselves and expressing ourselves sexually in a legit way? Or are we running from an actual problem that we're confronting within ourselves that's an indication of personal breakdown or personal struggle, or a situation that a person is in which is overpowering them, right? And so addiction is like that. Addiction, it takes control of a person's life to the point where it becomes the number one thing of focus and priority over everything else. And so that's why we say that if a person is sexually addicted, for them to go into a marriage is not necessarily going to get rid of that. They're going to have to develop themselves and train themselves in such a way that they can be more balanced, and sex is only part of their lives. It doesn't take over their lives completely. And so then marriage becomes a means by which they can express themselves sexually to their partner, but they do so freely. They don't do so tied or enslaved to an addiction, which is destroying their ability to see clearly, think clearly, and act in a way that is healthy. Because addictions, what they do is they put us in situations where we're acting out of behavior that is unhealthy, right? And so when we talk about a reason to get married, preserving chastity is a good reason for getting married, but under the condition that we're not talking about a person that is trying to escape or run from a problem that they're confronting. And there's degrees. Some people, marriage will solve uh, the issue that they have with sex, but they still need to seek out some assistance because they may have suffered some trauma in their lives, or they may be going through something that is undermining their ability to be functional, right? And that's something that is very important. And like the article that we read said, sex addiction functions like any other addiction. It begins to impair, begins to become an obstacle, because they have negative effects. So we shouldn't burden people with our problems to that degree. I wanted to say something before leaving. A lot of us, we forget that marriage shouldn't be an escape, and that's the reason why some people get married, because they're escaping. They want to escape their homes or escape some situations. That's a negative reason why some people get married. We shouldn't put our burdens on our spouses, right? And that's what we have to think about. If we care for a person that we're going to get married to, then we have to ensure that what we bring them is our best selves. Like Maslow said, we we want to self-actualize. We want to keep improving and growing. And marriage should be that relationship with which we improve and grow. We should bring that to our partner because we're living with that person. We're in a loving relationship with that person. So we have to be very honest with ourselves about what it is that we're going through deep down. Another issue is that marriage shouldn't be looked at as just an escape from lack of control of self. And some people make marriage like that. You know what I'm saying? Hurry up and get married so you don't fall into the haram. That's not a good way of looking at marriage. Although the intent is good and positive, is not a healthy way of looking at marriage. Right? We as human beings have to learn how to be the best that we can be and bring the best to our relationships. Yes, marriage can facilitate the sexual appetite, it can lessen it, it can make it better for us. But when we start having a wrong understanding of sex, but when we start having addictions that we're bringing in, or we have unresolved issues from our past, something may have happened to us, like being sexually violated, raped, molested, or a person may have been addicted to pornography and so on and so forth at a young age. They may have stopped. But then we bring all of these types of things into relationships, right? Uh, that are negative. And that's not what we should be doing. We should bring in positive things into relationships that allow us to grow in our deen, in our relationship with ourselves, with Allah, and with each other as a couple, right? That's extremely important to understand. And so when we talk about marriage and we talk about reasons why people get married, and we say that some choose marriage to preserve their chastity, what we want to talk about is choosing marriage as a healthy means by which we can express our sexuality. You know what I'm saying? And understanding sexuality in Islam, it consists both of experiencing pleasure and also being open to producing life, right? So sex in Islam is twofold. Is the issue of assisting in the continuity of the human race by reproduction. That's a human need, as the need for reproduction is a human need, as Maslow brought up in his hierarchy of needs, or how one understanding presents Maslow's hierarchy of needs that we read. But in Islam, hifd al-nasl or al-usra, preservation of lineage, is part of the objectives of the Sharia. Marriage is one of those means by which lineage is protected. And so, on top of that, the biological continuity of human beings is tied into sex, is tied into reproduction, sexual reproduction. And so, the relationship between men and women in Islam under the marital contract, it is a relationship in which sexual pleasure is experienced, but also being open to life itself, being, children being born in that relationship. So the two things go together. That's why, we have to realize that sex education in an Islamic light is very important. So when we talk about marriage as preserving chastity, we're talking about a big framework. We're talking about marriage preserving us in our humanity, and specifically in the dimension of allowing us to express ourselves sexually. But that doesn't only mean the sex act itself, it also means the affection that we can give, or that is natural to give to a person of the opposite sex. So doing that in a relationship that's recognized by Islam is being chaste, is having modesty, because we're expressing affection in a sexual way to a person that we love. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we are engaging in the sex act itself. That's something that's very important to understand. So yes, marriage, one of the reasons why people get married is to preserve chastity, but chastity is much more than just this idea that some people have that we're running from just falling into the haram. Come on now. We're not animals as human beings. We are human beings that Allah has given us status and dignity, and we should have much more control over ourselves. It shouldn't be that we look at marriage as just an escape from falling into the haram, but marriage should be looked at as something that is beautiful, that is a relationship in which, yes, we can express ourselves sexually and we can be chaste in it, but it's a relationship in which we grow. It's a relationship in which we have companionship. It's a relationship in which we share our lives with other people. We share our lives with our partners specifically, you know what I'm saying, and our children that come along with that, and relatives that come along with that. It's a very beautiful relationship. So it shouldn't be just looked at as an escape from falling into the haram. That's not a healthy way to look at it. With that, we end. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.